Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Inclusively with myself, Chris Lewis from Lewis Insight, and Monica Paolini from Senza Philly. We're delighted today to be joined by Chris McGinley, who is a senior research fellow at the Helen Hamlyn Centre in London and specialises in the topic of accessibility and inclusion. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about yourself and the Helen Hamlyn Centre?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, folks. Yeah, so I'm Chris McGinley. I lead the Age and Diversity Research Space at a centre called the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design. And we essentially are, I guess, pan design discipline centre. We work in all fields of design, but the thread that runs through everything is inclusion. And the term itself actually originated in the centre back in the early 90s with our original director, Roger Coleman. So we're based in the Royal College of Art, where everything is about creativity and, I guess innovating, doing things differently. And we can tap into that resource. So we're in a really fortunate space where we can champion inclusion and connect to a really, creative body of students and tutors and so on, experts.
Excellent. And tell us a bit about that notion of inclusive design. I mean, we've talked about it on Inclusively before, but we'd like to hear it from the horse's mouth about, what does it really mean and what things need to be considered. And you said you're focused a bit more on the elderly market, but how do you see all of the different excluded groups and how does the inclusive design shape up to address all those needs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for us, the origin, as you mentioned, was around aging. We were initially called Design Age, and we had an endowment from the Helen Hamlyn Trust to look into the subject of aging and how design seemed to be failing that market or ignoring that market almost. It was completely overlooked. And as that developed, I guess the strategy was how do we engage both the the customer, the user, the people who interact with these things. How can we engage them in the process? But then at the other end of that, it's okay, how do you almost entice business? So if you spoke about when I joined the center, 20 something years ago, if you went into a business setting and started to talk to inclusion, it felt like a really hard sell. So you were almost trying to entice people to come in, the sort of end user to tell us about their experience, to tell us about what was challenging and so on, to help us uncover ideas. And then on the other side of it, you were trying to entice business and say, look, if you make this design work better for more, you'll improve life and you'll sell more, like so you were trying to, I guess, bring everyone into the conversation. But for us, I think inclusive design is about identifying the kind of overlooked, the unheard voices and ensuring they have a position in the table, in the conversation. And a lot of what we do as well is use design to give people tools to express needs or to respond to potential futures so that we can design things better earlier or make the mistakes earlier. So by the time something's out there, it should it should be better than the original intentions. We should have framed the problem better so we're responding more accurately to what a real need is.
And are there, in your experience, are there industries or businesses that sort of buy into it more quickly? And of course, we come from a telecom perspective. So can you talk about the industries, the businesses that you think do embrace it and you've done a lot of work in, and then comment on the telecom industry specifically? Because I know you have done some work in the telecom industry.
Yeah, no, we have, over the years we've worked with BT, we've worked with Samsung, we've worked with Sony, we've worked with Panasonic, a whole host of different companies, Research in Motion, the BlackBerry guys back in the day. So I think that's probably quite telling that tech companies and your more, telecoms industry are willing to engage in that conversation. And I think in some ways there's more potential to be agile and to change things more quickly and to test things out. Um, Whereas if we're working on something like, the new London taxi, that's you're building quite significant, significant objects to test out. You can do it in kind of rough and ready, quick and dirty ways and chop bits off and stick bits on. But I think there is definitely a bit more involvement in that taking taking ideas, tweaking things, testing them out with, potential end users. I feel like tech industry and telecoms industry can do that more rapidly, which makes it a little more attractive. It's less of a barrier. Whereas if you are talking to someone, for example, I worked on some white goods a long time ago for a company in Japan, and anytime you wanted to build something, and this is a gas related kind of cooker, if you like, a conro. That was a major undertaking, to get something that looked and worked like it should so that you could get some real feedback. I feel you can do that more rapidly with maybe a device, a smartphone or whatever it may be. You can mock things up uh, more quickly.
May I ask you something here? It's kind of like in the other direction, is that clearly you're trying to do inclusive design. It could be like a common term or a specific term. So
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, what is it you do that is different? Because, these days everybody would say, well, we are trying to be inclusive, but I guess not everybody has the same depth of where it is that you're coming from. Um, just say that you want to do something more inclusive doesn't mean that you're going to be successful at it. So, what is
Yeah,
special about your approach to that?
yeah.
That
It's a good question, and I think it's a really interesting observation that we do see. It's kind of like buzzword bingo, isn't it? Oh, it's inclusive and it's disruptive and it's, you're like, okay, what does that mean? And I think that's possibly where we're different in that we've worked with over 200 organizations. So we have a portfolio of over 300 projects that we can refer to and draw from. And they have all been exploring different aspects of inclusion from aging through to neurodiversity or sensory impairment. And we have that full range that we'll tap into. So we are thinking quite broadly around inclusion. Often we're sort of purposely selecting who is the most challenging audience here, and let's bring them into the conversation. And I guess what's also quite unique to us is we are largely, I'd say 90% practicing designers. Our background is actually some discipline of design, even though now we're doing a lot of the research. So we'll use those skills and that background to create spaces, to create provocations, propositions that let people design with us. So we're kind of building designs together, and then there'll be a point where obviously if it gets a little too technical or it gets into a specific of the discipline, then we'll move with it and we'll move it forward. We don't expect someone to suddenly understand electronic engineering or something, like just out of thin air. But certainly in terms of framing what propositions should be about understanding the problem, understanding the different aspects, we'll use our design skills to communicate that and to get people to to go on the journey with us.
And is it, you mentioned that solving the problem, and I think that's one of the issues, certainly from our technology background. That we think, oh, we've got all this great technology, surely
Yeah.
it can address all of these issues. But often you're solving a point problem, and so in the past we've had that where you design something for a vision impaired person with a particular condition, so it might be enhancing video or giving you bigger font or whatever. But are you aware within customers, within your customers, that they think more holistically about solving all the problems for all of your excluded groups, or are we still people still a bit focused on solving point solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really sort of project specific. You know, there can be sometimes when it absolutely is about maybe physical access, it's about wheelchair access, and we would focus right in on that. But where there's the possibility to broaden that conversation, I think we would be tending to encourage people to think about, okay, where are the conflicts here? If you solve like you say, Chris, you know, if there's a focus on a visual impairment and you maybe talk about some you know, audio signals, then we would kind of, I guess, respond to that and say, yes, let's make sure we bring in someone that has lived experience around that and expertise around that. But let's also bring in someone where like audio difference or some kind of change to an auditory experience may maybe trigger them. Maybe it's someone with autism and they have a particular sensory trigger around volume and sound. So let's make sure we bring those people together so we can have a better sense of the larger problem and the compromises that might have to come about, but compromises that have been kind of mutually agreed. You know, like everyone's in the conversation and everyone puts, you know, plays their hand and says, this is what I would like, this is my needs, and this is my frustration. And then we try to sort of, you know, massage out something that can hopefully be better for more.
So who typically would be your customer? So because one of the problems that we encounter continually within the telecom world, actually, and the broader technology world, is that you do find accessibility and inclusion groups. As we've said many times, it can be in the corporate social responsibility or in the foundation piece, but it's not, or it could be spread throughout an organization. But there's no real focus at the top of the company that it doesn't make a boardroom discussion, let's say. So who typically would be your customer, and how and have you managed to spread that word more broadly into the top of organizations?
Yeah, I think again, I think that's, you know, a really spot on observation. You know, you'll often have um yeah, the kind of uh CSR groups, or there'll be an innovation manager. Or what I've found over the years is it's often someone that has a personal experience, you know, and that really motivates them. And they could be in any position within that company, you know, that just depends on, you know, their background, life experience, how the dice have fell. So you can get very senior level that maybe have an experience with a family member, a personal experience that motivates them to try and be more inclusive. We do like executive education where we'll bring in higher level, you know, more senior people within companies to talk to them around inclusive approaches and leadership that looks to inclusion. And I guess that hopes to filter that message through. And I think as well on the other side of things, it's a slight sort of tactical move. And I think it was Helen Hamlin herself, you know, that first kind of thought of this was if we could tap into the students of the RCA. So it's postgraduate, you know, most people there I think are around about, you know, late 20s, mid to late 20s. They have a couple of years experience typically before they come. It rates as the number one institution, postgraduate institution for art and design in the world, you know, year on year. The notion is if we can start to make people at that stage really think about inclusion, they filter out, and the alumni network from the RCA is incredible. You know that I think there's some weird stats or some weird line I've heard many times about if you walk through London, you're never more than, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's something like you're never further than 10 meters from an RCA design. So it's, if you can filter that inclusion sort of agenda, that perspective at that stage, then you're going to have heads of design and heads of companies and that more senior level that don't just think about it as inclusion, they just think about it as good design. Like this is literally what we should be doing to create better designs.
But have you ever
What do
come
you
across?
do to address sort of the other issue? Because clearly you need to have commitment from the top, but
Mm.
then you also need to have the existing designer. So obviously you train new students. I mean, so that's a good way. But also there is a lot of designers out there. So how do you basically teach them how to be more inclusive on a daily basis?
Um, I mean, I think it's a lot about, if you like, sort of design ethnography, like trying to put yourself into other people's shoes, using design skills to um to act upon insights. So designers are always looking, designers' instinct, I think, is to solve problems quickly. You know, it's like, here's the problem, and or here's a problem, and then they go, "Zoop," and there's a solution. And often that's a direct line, you know, instantly. Oh, I think almost anyone does it, but like, if you've been trained in a particular, you know, discipline, say my background's design engineering, product design engineering. So if someone talks to a product that's not working, immediately I'm thinking about solutions. But I think what we would do is we would say to these, you know, designers, you have to take a moment to step back and not jump to conclusions. Um, you have to think about, is the problem correctly framed and who's involved in that problem? How can you access those people? How can you talk to them? How can you gain some insights so that the solution is better? And designers want to come up with a good solution. You know, they want to come up with the best solution they can. And this is an ongoing, you know, an ongoing process that designers will always be able to improve and tweak, but they want to make the best stab at it that they can in that moment. And I think inclusion is one of those routes. You know, if you tap into these unheard voices or less represented groups, you're going to see things and you're going to be told things that haven't came up before. So that's going to be an opportunity for you to do something distinct and something different and something that people will applaud and use. You know, it'll be a successful design output. So for me, inclusion is a strategy to create good design. It is almost, that's enough. You know, that's convincing enough, I think, to designers that are trying to distinguish their outputs from others.
And is the possibility, or is the lack of, oh, what's the word? The the fact that the senior business people we're trying to convince about doing it, that they want to see the business case, it is often seen as a cost. It's a
Mm.
regulatory requirement, it's a cost, and they don't see a business upside to it. How do you think about that from your perspective?
Yeah, and that is a slightly difficult nut to crack. I do think there is that perspective of, oh, so if we're going to bring in users and we're going to do research and we're going to test things out, each of those feels like it's taking resource and that will cost. But I think you're 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 tapping into larger markets by doing it. So that's part of the, I guess, the conversation or the argument, if you like, that by designing in this way, you will get better return when you get a product out there. You've expanded your market. I think the other sort of response you could have to that is this notion around, I think Frank Lloyd Wright spoke about making a mistake on the drawing board so that you can use an eraser, a rubber, to correct it, rather than having it built and realizing your mistake and then you have to use a sledgehammer, you know. So it's that idea of, if you can get ahead of issues and understand where things could work better later. That's
Yeah.
where the research and the inclusion and what have you, that's where that front loading of your process will save you lots of money in the long term. So I think there's different arguments and different logic you can use to make the case.
Yep.
But it's still, I think people want to see examples. We did it recently. We had funding around what we called the Design Age Institute, and we were tackling this very issue. It was, look, we know how to design inclusively. We know how to do great research. We know how to frame problems. We know how to get to a kind of first concept that's really compelling. But we seem to, in that middle bit where you're trying to get it commercialized, get it in front of businesses, get business support, there seems to be a gap. And then on the other side, you have businesses that are saying, oh, for example, the gray market, the aging market is massive, and we would love to tap into it. Can you show us some examples? Or, what is it? Is it 20%, 25% of the UK population uh, have a disability that they've, that's been sort of recorded, and probably there's huge numbers beyond that aren't actually recorded as such. So again, if in terms of a market, it's like, oh well, that's a massive market. But I think there's fear, and they want to see where are the products that are doing this really well, and also can we, in the true sense of inclusion, can we do something that won't be exclusive or then be seen as an aging product or a product around disability and accessibility product. And I think that is, it's a shared goal. We don't want to put out something that doesn't sit well in someone's home, for example, that looks kind of alien or stigmatizing. That's the complete opposite of good design. So we would never do that. So in some ways that's maybe a slight misunderstanding of what inclusive design is to some of those more, senior level people. They hear the word inclusion or inclusive design or accessible design, and then they immediately move to this other, like that, not a readily available product, a commercial product that would be in their homes. They maybe think of some piece of tech kit that they've seen at an exhibition or someone trying to push, and they've not seen how that would fit in their life or how that's desirable. In that, I think in part is the issue that a lot of the history of accessible tech has maybe done it a slight disservice because it's sort of MIT, full wearable helmets, to help with whatever, some kind of sensory loss, and that obviously doesn't have a place in everyday life. Whereas I remember, Chris, when you came to one of our events, you had those very snazzy Ray-Bans,
Uh-huh.
and I mean that's like an incredibly desirable product, like it's just well thought out, and the intelligence and the extra information you get from that is desirable to everyone. It's the right approach, rather than, I'm not slagging off MIT, don't get me wrong, but those kind of groups that are very tech driven and don't have the finesse, or the user insight to go, okay, how will people actually use these things? I think that's part of maybe a history that we have to address and show people, look, there's real potential to do things that make experience better for all, can be really incredibly desirable, can have, the designer brand, if that's your thing. All of that can be included here. All of that is part of the solution.
And I think that what you say is very important, that like 20-25% of the population is basically in need of a more inclusive approach. But a lot of like elderly people don't see themselves as being somewhat disabled, which they are.
Yeah.
Or not even older people, And so I think that we are accepting maybe more of the disabled population, but we don't consider ourselves part of it to some
Yeah.
extent. So, and I think that this is really important to see it as a broad market. Could you tell us, like in your experience, was it something where you just did it like it was kind of a haha moment, like, this is something I was not expecting. This is so much better. If possible in telecoms, but in general, what is that you started like, oh my God, this makes so much difference?
In a solution, do you mean like
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like, I'm sure that some things like, I'm like, oh my God, look at this. This is so incredible.
yeah, I mean, oh, as I say, we've got about 300 projects, so it's always hard
Mm.
to pull one out. But I think a common sort of trait, if you like, in solutions, I think a lot of the time is removing the noise, like communicating things much more clearly. That seems to be part of solutions. So whether that's, you know, remote controls or instructions for a mobile device or the mobile device itself, or the interface, there's a tendency, or there was, I think we're getting a lot better with it, but there was a tendency to bombard people with lots and lots and lots of options, but have no clarity in how they navigate those options. And I think that's often the aha moment is you take something, say a company approaches us and says, this is causing more issue than we thought it should, and it's really clever. It's like, our engineers, bust a gut, and our tech people are, you know, like chuffed with the outputs, like they're really impressed with what they've come up with here. And it's like that's great. It's all in there. But if people can't access it because you've just not communicated those functions well, then it's kind of useless. Like you may have innovated in some really interesting way, but if someone can't find, you know, the route to switch that on or to access that feature, you've kind of failed. So I think a lot of the aha moments are stripping away too many options and really adding clarity to this is how you do, you press X to get Y to work, and it's as simple as that. You don't have to, you know, say it is a mobile device. You don't have to navigate to such and such a screen, then press this app and then go to that setting. And then, take away those steps, I think is often the aha moment. And you can see it when you give a prototype to someone and you've stripped away all those steps and they want to do something and it happens immediately. Like they will literally, you know, have a beaming smile and I've got it right. It's like it's for me, inclusion is very much about access. For sure it has to be accessible, but also pleasure. Like that moment of the smile means you've got it right there. That's good design. They've accessed it and they're pleased with what it's done. It's desirable. Um, I think that's the aha. The aha is access and pleasure, like make the experience what it should be.
So in some ways, we're unstitching what we did with the web in the early days of the web, where we threw everything at the screen. And I mean,
Yeah.
as the blind person trying to navigate websites, trying to find that button to play the video, or trying to find that bit of information, or where to put my stuff in, it's a jungle. You're navigating through a jungle. So I totally agree. That
Yeah.
simply the simplification of it. One sort of final thought that occurs to me, Chris, the we're moving from I know you do a lot of hardware stuff, but we're moving towards a more a softer design element. Because software is there, and we might use AI and agents to do things.
Mm.
But the way in which humans communicate with each other, and let's say with devices in the future, do you see that changing? I mean, your focus on the elderly market is obviously those people went through generations where they could pick up a phone and they could write a letter, and the younger generations are coming through where they just expect to tap a screen and do things. Do you see the way we as humans communicate changing, and therefore the way we design around that becoming more of a challenge, or is it going to be an easier challenge because it's in that sort of soft development environment?
I think it's going to be an equal challenge, that there is this notion that, okay, if you have baby boomers or whoever, Gen X and so on, people that were pre-internet and were right in the middle of it, they experienced life without the internet and then post-internet. But I think technology is always advancing, and the way we use it and the way we communicate is always advancing. So there's always going to be some learning that needs to happen. And I think these different modes are fantastic. Like we just a couple of weeks ago, were involved in the launch of a new PAS, with British standards. So ourselves and Tata Consultancy Services um, sponsored this PAS, which is all about vocal accessibility. And there's huge challenges still there, and so many different components that I think the challenge is sort of keeping abreast of all the advancements, of all the new modes of communication, of the preferences. Like I have a 12-year-old, and he calls me a boomer. I'll send him a message on the phone, and it'll be like, how you doing, pal? I'll be back in, half an hour. Do you want me to pick anything up? Whatever. Love you, Dad. Something to that effect. And he'll just give me like 3 letters back in my text message. So there's this very different, I guess, yeah, a different approach to communication. So I'm expected to understand what those 3 letters mean,
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and he finds the fact that he has to read 3 sentences, a waste of his time almost, it seems. So like there's an interesting idea around time, taking the time to communicate that we'll have to navigate. Maybe we want to carve, I mean, I'm going to talk from my perspective. I want to carve out more time for those exchanges. A 3-letter response is not adequate for me, but that's my preference. So we've got to look at these different perspectives and, as far as possible, let communication technology support, but give options. Maybe there's some element of translation, you know. It,
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say
it,
that. In fact, I don't know whether you watched Adolescence yet, Chris, but there's a great,
no.
watch it. There's some great stuff in there about how the teenagers in school use symbols, emojis to communicate, and which we would never pick up on. It's definitely worth watching from that point of view.
Yeah, and I think that exactly, all the emojis and what have you, it's funny how we pick up, so they were developed in Japan, had a sort of slightly different purpose, and they're, like you said, people have placed meaning on them, and everything's always changing, everything is organic in that way within communication. So yeah, we have to, and I think you mentioned AI as well. I think the potential there to support, to provide options, to do some form of translation, on whatever level that is, whether that's just simply this emoji means this, boomer, And I go, okay, brilliant. I think that there is there's always scope to improve, and the routes that we take to communicate are ever changing. And that's why there's a real role for design in an ongoing way.
Mm.
I'm pretty confident I'm not going to be, touch wood, out of a job anytime soon, because there is always going to be scope for design to make things better, and there's always going to be scope for things to be more inclusive. Like it's just a mission, an ongoing mission.
Love it,
Hey,
Chris.
Chris, our time is up, but and I really like your approach to simplicity, pleasure, and making sure you do what people want. I mean, I think that that's a very interesting way to look at it. Do you have any closing thoughts, any call to arms to the telecom people out there?
I mean, there were some good words. I think, yeah, just to engage people in the process throughout, like no one is more of an expert on people's lives than the people themselves. So, you just have to bring them in. And there is, I mentioned that Paz, that's great. But all that is a little bit of scaffold, that's just something to interrogate the problem more. So I think my other tip would be to know the problem well so that you're addressing the right challenge.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And it was great talking to you, Chris. And thank you all for listening to our Inclusively podcast.